In school, we are taught that the American dream is getting good grades and doing well in school. We are taught that it is making a lot of money and getting a good job that pays well, that it is building a family and making a home. However, history teaches us a different perspective. Mainly that the American dream is the ability to defend oneself and one's business, personal property, and personal gain from various types of extortion like taxes, lawfully, processing fees, and license fees, among other things. And it also means protecting ourselves from extortion from legal offenders. The America of the dream was intended to be a public haven, or rather a heaven, for the general populace of the world. The public, of course, are regular people and not corrupt, connected individuals or corporations or any other entity that is listed as the equivalent to a natural-born person. On the other hand, we find our pockets picked at every turn, and we are subject to mandates and all sorts of tyranny that were never intended. In the Naval War of 1812, or The History of the United States by Theodore Roosevelt from 1858 to 1919, we find some explanations of what the American dream was supposed to look like. In a passage, we find the state of the Navy at the time of the War of 1812. Quote, "Nearly every senior officer had extricated himself by his own prowess or skill from the dangers of battle or storm. He owed his rank to the fact that he had proved worthy of it. Thrown upon his own resources, he had learned self-reliance. He was a first-rate practical seaman and prided himself on the way his vessel was handled. Having reached his rank by hard work and knowing what real fighting meant, he was careful to see that his men were trained in the essentials of discipline and that they knew how to handle the guns in battle as well as polish them in peace. Beyond almost any of his countrymen, he worshipped the gridiron flag. The stern school in which the American was brought up forced him into habits of independent thought and action which it was impossible that the more protected Briton could possess. He worked more diligently and less from routine, and while perfectly obedient and amenable to discipline, was yet able to judge for himself in an emergency. Now this," end quote, Now this is in contrast to the current Navy of today, which boasts a body of officers which are chosen based off of diplomas rather than merit. In continuation, the reasons for the war being declared, quote, "The principles for which the United States contended in 1812 are now universally accepted, and those so tenaciously maintained by Great Britain find no advocates in the civilized world. That England herself was afterward completely reconciled to our views was amply shown by her intense indignation when Commodore Wilkes, in the exercise of the right of search for the persons of the foes of his country, stopped the neutral British ship Trent, while the applause with which act was greeted." Now, in a separate part, the view professed by Great Britain in 1812 respecting the rights of belligerents and neutrals was diametrically opposite to that held by the United States. "Between England and the United States of America," writes a British author, "a spirit of animosity caused chiefly by the impressment of British seamen, or of seamen asserted to be such from on board of American merchant vessels, had unhappily subsisted for a long time prior to the war. It is, we believe," he continues, "an acknowledged maxim of public law as well, that no nation but the one he belongs to can release a subject from his natural allegiance as that. Provided the jurisdiction of another independent state be not infringed, every nation has a right to enforce the services of her subjects wherever they may be found." Now, with the first part of this, I'm sure most of us would disagree with the statement that these principles are universally accepted, as today they are universally abhorred and ignored by very dictatorial powers that we find ourselves under. Furthermore, in the second position, there is a problem with this one, as most merchantmen of the time would have been armed when the Second Amendment of the Constitution was upheld. But of course, there is a lot of propagandizing of past histories, especially that which pertains to current situations of today. And this was, of course, written by a British author much later after the War of 1812. Now, in a different part, we find an explanation of a admitted explanation of propagandizing in historical documents and by historians, which shouldn't call themselves historians. Quote, similarly, most American writers mention the actions in which the privateers were victorious, but do not mention those in which they were defeated, while the British in turn record every successful cutting out expedition, but ignore entirely those which terminated unfavorably. Other errors arise from honest ignorance. And in the other part, quote, British frigates invariably greatly overestimated the loss of the latter, so that on both sides there were some intentional misstatements or garblings, and a much more numerous class of simple blunders, arising largely from an incapacity for seeing more than one side of the question. Among the early British writers upon this war, the ablest was James. He devoted one work, his Naval Occurrences, entirely to it, and it occupies the largest part of the 6th volume of his more extensive History of the British Navy. However, in a different part, it is even admitted that the aforementioned James is nothing short of a propagandist and not a very good one. In quote, James certainly did not intend to arrive at, namely, that 300 British led by American officers could beat with ease and comparative impunity 400 British led by their own officers. He also forgets that the whole consists of the sum of the parts. And now we get another look at the opposition between the British Empire's look and the American one. Such wide differences in the views of the two nations produced endless difficulties. To escape the press gang, or for other reasons, many British seamen took service under the American flag. And if they were demanded back, it is not likely that they or their American shipmates had much hesitation in swearing either that they were not British at all, or else that they had been naturalized as Americans. Equally probable is it that the American blockade runners were guilty of a great deal of fraud and more or less thinly veiled perjury. In the next part, quote, 5 years' residence within her territory, and after having complied with certain forms, became one of her citizens as completely as if he was native born. And of course that is talking about the United States. And continuing, Great Britain contended that her warships possessed the right of searching all neutral vessels for the property and persons of her foes. The United States, resisting this claim, asserted that free bonds make free goods, and that consequently her ships were on the high seas should not be molested on any pretext whatever. Finally, Great Britain's system of impressment, the best idea of which can be gained by reading Marryat's novels, by which men could be forcibly seized and made to serve in her navy, no matter at what cost to themselves, was repugnant to every American idea. Of course, that last part is not as repugnant today as it might have been then, and also we are very far from this uniform system of naturalization that the Constitution talks about, and we are more aligned with the British idea of the ability to search and seize anything they deem worthy. In a separate part, we find an explanation of what Great Britain's specific doctrine was, and that is, quote, Great Britain's doctrine was once a subject, always a subject. On the other hand, the United States maintained that any foreigner, and there it ends. However, I would say that, and I think most would agree, that currently the United States practices the doctrine of once a subject, always a subject. And on the next part, any innocent merchant vessel was liable to seizure at any moment, and when overhauled by a British cruiser short of men was sure to be stripped of most of her crew. The British officers were themselves the judges as to whether seamen should be pronounced a native of America or of Britain, and there was no appeal from their judgment. If a captain lacked his full complement, there was little doubt as to the view he would take of any man's nationality. The wrongs inflicted on our seafaring countrymen by their impressment into foreign ships formed the main cause of the war. Now, in the last part, we get a better idea of why the war was fought, and also why we have the current situation that we have today. at least allegedly. But the War of 1812 has a lot of propagandizing and misdirection written into it by modern and past historians. So we can't accurately say for certainty anything about the elements of the situation, but we can say that we are definitely not living in the American dream of those that built the country. Quote, free trade and sailors' rights. Quote, we were contending for free trade and sailors' rights, meaning by the former expression freedom to trade wherever we chose without hindrance save from the power with whom we were trading, and by the latter that a man who happened to be on the sea should have the same protection accorded to a man who remained on land. Nominally, neither of these questions was settled by or even alluded to in the Treaty of Peace, but the immense increase of reputation that the Navy acquired during the war practically decided both points in our favor. End quote. Now in this part we find, as on many occasions, we won the war but lost at the same time due to treachery and treason on the part of those that called themselves lawmakers. On the other hand, the only definitive element of treason can be found in the Treaty of 1871 when the U.S. was sold to Great Britain for a large sum of money. And in the next part, we find an interesting passage which relates to the dubious nature of the War of 1812 and that which is written about it. Quote, only success attained was burning the public buildings of Washington, and that result was of dubious value. Baltimore was attacked next, and the attack repulsed. After the forts and ships had shelled one another with the slight results that usually attend that particular and harmless species of warfare. Now, one possible reason for that problematic element in the War of 1812 is that Washington, D.C. did not actually exist at the time. But there are other possible logical conclusions. Either way, what we are taught about the war is certainly wrong.